Good evening. I'm Marita Golden, and welcome to Our Mothers Ourselves, a celebration of the strong Black women who made us strong. Tonight's program is a continuation of a conversation that I've been having since the October publication of my book, The Strong Black Woman: How a Myth Endangers the Physical and Mental Health of Black Women. This is a conversation that I think is very important, and I'm so glad to have my sister friends, who I'll introduce shortly, on this conversation with me. Tonight, we're going to talk about our mothers as symbols and sources of strength, inspiration, but we're also going to talk about their deferred dreams. We're going to talk about their vulnerabilities and how, in some ways, we may have differed or moved away from some of the legacies that they bequeathed us. We're also going to talk about joy and how we prioritize joy and happiness and health in our lives. Because we're having a conversation that, in many ways, was not possible for our grandmothers and our mothers to have. While we are having our discussion, I want to urge you in the audience to think about your mothers, your grandmothers, and stories that you may want to share with us during the question and answer period. And also feel free to post your questions. So I'm really pleased to have this illustrious panel with me tonight, two of whom are old friends, one who is a new friend. The new friend is Dr. Inger Burnett Ziegler, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. She's an advocate for normalizing participation in mental health care treatment and ensuring that all individuals have access to high quality, evidence based mental health care. She is the author of the book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen: The Emotional Lives of Black Women. Janice Kearney, an old friend, is the author of and publisher and literary coach and founder of a nonprofit arts and literacy organization. She's joining us from Arkansas. Inger is joining us from Chicago. Janice was born to Southeast Arkansas cotton sharecroppers, attended Gould Public Schools, and graduated from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville with a BA in journalism. She's written or co-written 17 books, including her first, the critically acclaimed Cotton Field of Dreams, a memoir, as well as Something to Write Home About: Memories from a Personal Diarist. And in 2014, Janice founded the Celebrate Maya Project. Its mission is to promote the life and legacy of Dr. Maya Angelou through Arkansas's communities and schools. And Bernice L. McFadden, another longtime friend, is the author of The Book of Harlan, winner of the 2017 American Book Award and the 2017 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. This, in addition to 8 other critically acclaimed novels, including Sugar, Loving Donovan, and Gathering of Waters. She's a 4-time Hurston Wright Legacy Award finalist, as well as the recipient of 4 awards from the BCALA. Her latest novel, Praise Song, as well as her latest novel, Praise Song, won the 2018 Women's Prize. And Bernice is joining us from New Orleans, where she teaches at Tulane University. So we have a geographically diverse panel tonight. And I want to start the discussion by reading a poem. This is a poem that when I was coming of age, when I was in college in the late 60s, early 70s, was an iconic poem about Black women. This was a period of enormous militancy, finding our identity as Black people. It was also a time of great flowering for Black women writers. And Mary Evans was a writer who captured a lot of our attempts to claim and assert our pride as a people and our pride as women. And this is a poem that was very iconic and really captured, I think it captures a lot of what we're talking about when we say the strong Black woman. And this is a poem that's rooted in the historical pain and suffering of Black people and the historical sacrifices of Black women. I Am a Black Woman by Mary Evans. I am a Black woman. The music of my song, some sweet arpeggio of tears, is written in a minor key, and I can be heard humming in the night, can be heard humming in the night. I saw my mate leap screaming to the sea, and I, with these hands, cup the life breath from my issue in the canebrake. I lost Nat's swinging body in a rain of tears and heard my son scream all the way from Anzio for peace he never knew. I learned Da Nang and Pork Chop Hill in anguish. Now my nostrils know the gas, and these trigger tired fingers seek the softness in my warrior's beard. I am a Black woman, tall as a cypress, strong beyond all definition, still defying place and time and circumstance, assailed, impervious, indestructible. Look on me and be renewed. So I think that you can see why that poem became so iconic and meant so much to us who were loud, proud, Black, and basically redefining our identities. So I wanted to start out with a question about our mothers. And I wanted to ask everybody on the panel to talk about who your mother was when you were born. I'd like you to use her name. And I'm also interested in her age and who you know she was, and maybe even who you imagine she was, because she was your mother and you knew her well enough to know some of the things that she may not have shared with you. In my case, my mother was 42 years old. Her name was Beatrice Reed, her maiden name. And when I was born, she had left her husband, her second husband, who suffered from the disease of alcoholism, and she'd begun a relationship with my father. Even though she never expected to be pregnant, I was her first biological child at the age of 42. She told me years later, when I had a pregnancy scare and thought that I was pregnant and was debating what to do, that she never thought to not have me. She said she thought that she would be denying the world a great person. And so my mother had a very complicated life, leaving one relationship, beginning another, and yet fulfilled by motherhood. Inger?
Well, first, Marita, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the panel today. It's an honor to be here with you and Janice and Bernice. My mother's story is one that I talk about in my book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. My mother was 33 years old when she had me. She had been in a relationship with my father that began shortly after being divorced from someone else. Her previous husband had also struggled with alcoholism, gambling. She left that relationship. And shortly thereafter, in her words, she says she wasn't looking for anything. But shortly thereafter, she started a relationship with my father, who was married and had another family.
Complicated.
Complicated. Um, and so, I so appreciate this question because, in writing the book, it really allowed me the opportunity to learn this story that I had never learned before, and to have these conversations with my mom. And she told me, marriage hadn't worked out, but she still wanted a child. And she thought that, this probably isn't going to turn into that idealistic family that one might think of, but she wanted to have a child, and she similarly said, I never thought about not having you. Um, so she created this family with my dad, who was an ongoing presence in my life, and um, yeah, it was me, my mom, and my dad, 33 years old, for her, in what at the time seemed like a normal family for me.
Yeah, what I hear is your mother, like my mother, took a leap of faith and she created what she felt would be her own happiness.
That's right. That's right. And, to that point, when I ask her, how that felt for her, she will say it felt fine. She says in a lot of ways that relationship was better than the relationships that she had left before. That my dad could offer more to her in terms of stability, that he kind of doted on her in a lot of ways that, the guys that she had dated previously had not, and provided her, you know, elements of a relationship, elements of a family that she hadn't yet had that she really wanted to have. And so she embraced that and kind of put the complicated piece put the complicated piece to the side. Yeah.
Right. Janice?
That is a wonderful question, Marita. And I also thank you for inviting me uh, to join these amazing women and listening to their stories. Just
Excuse me. What was your mother's name, Inger?
Marsha
Okay.
Ziegler. And I
Okay.
still carry her last name. I carry her last name and my father's last name. So,
Okay.
yep.
Okay. Janice? Your
uh,
mother's name?
my mother's name is Ethel Virginia. Ethel Virginia. And my mother was 36 years old when I was born. And it's interesting that you both say they never thought about not having you. My mother never thought about having 19 children. Children. I was her 12th. So she
Wow.
had children, she had raised children by the time I came along. My mother was someone that I went through life trying to figure out, trying to know her better. She was almost mythical in the fact that my dad would tell us the story how he dreamed about her before he met her. And he described everything that she had on in his dreams and how somehow he ended up at her family's house and he went into the house looking for the things that he saw in his dreams because he saw this woman through the window that he knew was her. He went through the house and found the green shoes, the green coat, the green hat. So she's almost a mythical woman. The other part of her myth is that she never told us very much about her life before she met my dad. She was 19 and she already had a child. She had had a child at 17. My father had a child from a previous marriage. So they brought two children into the marriage, but they had together, they had 17 children together. So my mother, whatever it is that she didn't want us to know, we never found out. And
Right.
I'll read some in a little bit about how that impacted me, but I tried very hard to find out. But she was beautiful. She was smart, brilliant. She was a church leader. She was a community leader. She was a school leader. And she didn't have a high school education. Neither one of them did. But she was the brightest, most amazing woman that I ever knew, and I'm still trying to figure her out.
And Janet, I remember when we met and you told me about growing up, the child of sharecroppers and the number of siblings you had had. And I just, because all of your siblings are so extraordinarily distinguished and talented, I just thought, what a family, what a mother and what a father, you must have had. So, You may
Thank
not
you.
known all their secrets, but she did well. She did well by you. Yeah. And we'll talk about secrets later on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bernice?
Um, Let me echo everybody else by saying thank you, Marita, for inviting me to this. My mother's name is Vivian, and she had me at the age of 21. She was raised until the age of 9 by her great grandmother, my grandmother Rosie, down in Sandersville, Georgia. And she joined her mother, my grandmother Thelma, in Detroit at the age of 9. My grandmother had my mom at 15. And so my mother always says, my grandmother just passed in October at 96. But my mother always said that I always felt like I was the mother in that relationship. She's like, I was the one that, cooked the food, cleaned the house, and tried to keep my grandmother on the straight and narrow because she was a young woman and she was a beautiful woman. And she was, running the streets and partying. And my mother was very different. She was really anchored and stable. I think that her biggest regret in life, and she's going to be 79 in the next few weeks, is that she did not receive an education. She was the great grandchild of sharecroppers, and so once the children in the home reached age 8, they went into the fields. And my mother is just, hungry for knowledge, and it's only at this time late in life that she is reading on a daily basis. I swear to God, she reads more than I do at this point. And she struggles, and we work with that, but that is her greatest joy. And she loves history, and I love history, and I didn't even know this about her until recently, like the past 5 or 6 years, how interested she was in history. So, yeah, I think that now when I sit and reflect on who my mom is, I didn't realize how much alike we were until recently.
Yeah. I asked each of the panelists to think about something that they've written that they'd like to share, because we're all writers, and of course we have to write about our mothers because we are writers. And I had edited an anthology called Wild Women Don't Wear No Blues, Black Women Writers on Love, Men, and Sex, back in the 90s. And I wrote an essay about my mother and what watching her had taught me about love. And that is, the things that I wanted to emulate and the things that I didn't want to do. My mother was a woman who could leave. I remember when I was researching her for my first book, because she died when I was 21. And her best friend said, your mother was something else. I mean, she would leave a man. And back in those days, we didn't leave. We didn't leave husbands, no matter how bad they were. But your mother would leave. And it was from this woman that I found out a secret, that my mother had a husband before she left Greensboro, North Carolina, to come to Washington, D.C. So she left a husband in Greensboro to come to Washington, D.C. And each man that she left to be free. She left to be happy. She left to be herself. And that was a powerful lesson, that you can leave, that's never too late to leave. And this is really striking me very powerfully now, because in my family, we're dealing with a situation with a young woman who is in a codependent, enabling relationship with a family member. And she's addicted to this difficult relationship and does not know how to leave. So even though we're in 2022, some people still don't know how to leave. This is the first 3 paragraphs from the essay that I wrote. Everything I've learned about love, I learned from my mother. For it is mothers who bend, twist, flex, and break most dramatically before our uninitiated eyes. Fathers bear, conceal, inflict, sometimes vanish, so the mythology of domestic union tells us. But mothers absorb, accept, give in, all to tutor daughters in the syntax, the grammar of yearning and love. My mother, Beatrice Lee Reed, fled poverty in Greensboro, North Carolina in the late 20s, leaving an ex husband behind. I learned of this prior husband offhandedly in passing, a secret hoarded until I was nearly 20. She arrived in Washington, D.C., radiant, ambitious, and subsequently married two more men. The first of the two, Mr. Robinson, was benevolent and possessed of a heart he swore was designed only to love my mother. But Mr. Harold Robinson, haunted by childhood demons and doubts, was an alcoholic who too often sank to the status of drunk. And while in the grip of such anguish, he drove away the woman that in his irregular moments of lucidity and confidence, he almost perfectly loved. Francis Sherman Golden was my father's third husband. He was steel willed and eager to control the small fortune my mother had gained through gambling and hard work. Even more than he wanted to love Beatrice Lee Reed, Francis Sherman Golden longed to conquer and absorb her will. To my mother, he must have seemed as large as Mr. Robinson appeared small. Francis Sherman Golden was my father.
Mm.
And so in the essay, I talk about this tug of wills, these two strong women. I mean, I'm as strong willed as my mother. I mean, and I saw my mother physically fight with my father. And I learned from my mother that a woman could take a blow. But I also learned from my mother that she could stop taking a blow, stop giving blows, and that even if she had to walk away from a rooming house that she owned, from financial stability, she could walk away.
Mm.
Inger?
Wow. So
Yeah.
much of what you just said resonates with me. My grandmother, who is, I'm going to read my passage about, was someone who also left and had that strong will and didn't take any stuff from anybody and really set that example. But my mother actually was quite different. She had much more of an attitude of, um, just acceptance of things as they are. Um, Perhaps not envisioning what different or more, asking for more, expecting more could be like, or even really appreciating that possibility. Um, and so, that just got me thinking about how that moves through generations, from going from that person that's like, I'm out of here, which my grandmother was, and my mom was much more, this will do. Like, I'm fine. This is all I need right now.
I think they call it go along to get along.
That's her. That's her. My grandmother was one of my first examples of a strong Black woman. She left her man in Montgomery, Alabama in 1951 and headed north as a single mother, along with millions of other Black people during the second wave of the Great Migration, in pursuit of better employment opportunities and perhaps also a new suitor. At that time, fewer than 20% of Black families had a female head of household with no husband present. When she arrived in Chicago in 1954, after making a pit stop in Pennsylvania, she and my mother lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the west side in the Jane Addams Homes. The public housing complex was initially built for impoverished Italian and Russian Jewish residents. They moved out of the neighborhood as Black families were beginning to trickle in, along with several notorious street gangs.
Mm.
Despite the welfare laws that prohibited grandma from working, she held a job as a seamstress. She made curtains during the day and attended Crane Junior College at night.
Mm.
Assured that her fate would ultimately turn, she rolled her dice on herself and played her numbers in the policy game, the underground lottery in the neighborhood. Her younger sisters, who remained in their distressed marriages, sent in money to help fill in the financial gaps of the husband that she'd left behind. But my grandmother's thorny temperament ensured that they remained on the outskirts of her and my mother's lives and kept them isolated and without the emotional support that they didn't know they needed. Grandma never rested in good enough. With every accomplishment, the lust for the sufficiency of validation dwindled only slightly. For more than 30 years, she worked as an unemployment counselor at the state of Illinois Department of Labor. When I went to work with her as a little girl, I imagined that I too had an important job helping people, answering the phone and writing memos that would ultimately change the course of someone's life. The constant flow of other people not having enough kept my grandmother moving forward. She quietly repaid her debts to the system that had helped her to claw her way out of poverty, yet she could never afford to let down her defenses. Eventually, when she was more than 50 years old, Grandma moved out of public housing and returned to school through a program offered by her employer to earn her bachelor's degree at Roosevelt University. At that time, only 8% of Black women in the United States had a college education. In the early 1970s, when predatory lending, redlining, and restrictive covenants were rampant in Chicago, she purchased a ranch house facing the train tracks in the previously Dutch community of Roseland. White flight was at its peak as Black folks rapidly began to occupy the neighborhood. With every visit I made to Grandma's house, she planted the seeds of my self-worth and willed to me her expectations for greatness. They were seeped in the lemons Lipton tea that we sweetened with packets of Equal and sipped out of pink porcelain teacups. We drank and held our pinkies out while speaking in fake British accents. She and I sat in perfect manner in her ornate wooden dining room chairs, which swallowed my petite frame and left my feet dangling beneath the table. As we delicately placed the teacups down on the saucers, we pursed our lips together and fluttered our eyelids, mimicking the air that we imagined rich and important people had. Be still and stop kicking, Grandma said, teaching me how to be proper and dignified. Grandma's hope for me was interlaced between her fingers, and she kneeled down on the floor with me next to the bed as I said my prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, being sure to ask God to bless Grandma, Mommy, and Daddy. In the morning, she sent me home with a promise for prosperity, folded in greeting cards that held an Our Daily Bread devotional booklet and 20 crisp dollar bills that she slid to me behind my mother's back. A third for you, a third for tithes, and a third for your piggy bank. And one day you'll be rich like Grandma, she said.
Thank you. Janice?
I am going to read. I did not write this in my, is there an echo? I did not write this in my original memoir, but it could very well have been in there. And this is entitled Searching for My Mother and Myself. I believed Mama would live forever. The day I learned she wouldn't, I changed from the shy and quiet girl who saw good in everything to a child who lived in fear and uncertainty about everything. The solid ground I'd walked on all my life turned less solid, left me less assured. 4 years earlier, I turned my life over to Jesus, giving up some of my fondest things like fighting my younger brother, calling my sister ugly names, and daydreaming about boys. And he still let me down after I'd been so good. Mama's illness did not take her from me, not then, not for another 10 years. By then I was an adult, consumed with another life, being a wife and mother and excelling at my job. What I'd always imagined was that one day I'd forge a friendship with this woman I so adored and held in awe. I knew such a relationship would require something meaningful from me. I'd have to earn that friendship. Only then would I be credentialed for a sisterhood with my mother. So with my adulthood fully in hand, possessing both a husband and a child, within 6 months of each other. I was confident our bond would be sealed forever. We would share notes about life, about my future, but most importantly, about her past. No, let me be honest. My mother's past was what I greedily craved. You see, I was convinced that this question mark I'd carried around inside my heart all my life would be suddenly erased once I learned all there was to know about the woman who birthed me, giving me that much needed link to her, serving as a looking glass. Fate, being the jokester he's known to be, had other plans. In March of 1982, my expectations of befriending Ethel Virginia Kearney abruptly came to an end. Mama's cancer returned with a roar. She lived almost 2 years, then quietly slipped away. And somewhere during those days of unrelenting grief, my mind cleared long enough to imagine Mama lying in that tiny hospital bed, hours, maybe minutes before closing her eyes for good, but with that gentle, bemused smile, knowing that she had waited me out, that she would leave me with her secrets intact, with her past unsealed, closed forever to me and my siblings. I had been so close, almost seeing behind that beautiful, mysterious woman's veil, peering deeper than she wanted me to at times. What an arrogant rogue death is, an uninvited guest arriving unfashionably early. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Bernice?
Um, I'm going to read from an essay that I published on Goodreads in the summer of 2020 called What Didn't Kill Her? You were born in 1943 and were just a toddler when your teenage mother fled north, leaving you in the care of your great-grandmother, Rosa May, beloved school teacher, follower of Christ, devoted wife, and mother of 11 children, including the son that had raped your mother. Grandma Rosie kept you close, took you everywhere she went, even to the fields to pick cotton. There she gave you a burlap sack, and beneath that ruthless Georgia sun, you shadowed her up and down those rows, plucking cotton boils from thorny stems. You thought it was a game. You didn't know that cotton paid for the kerosene in the lamps, the clothes on your back, and the fatback beans and cornbread that filled all of the bellies in that house. You didn't know you had a mother until she showed up, a tiny yellow thing with a mane of dark hair and tits as big as her personality. When she walked into the house and called you to her, you looked over your shoulder to see who she was talking to because wasn't no one in that house named Vivian. Grandma Rosie called you little girl, and everyone else that lived there called you Pootney. When you didn't move, Grandma Rosie gave you a little shove and said, little girl, your mama calling you, go on over and give her a hug. So on that day, you learned two things. You learned you had a mother and that your name was Vivian. You were happy to rid yourself of that stupid nickname, but weren't too keen on the woman who claimed you as her own. Whether you liked her or not, one autumn, she sent for you to come and live with her and her hustler boyfriend in a cold water kitchenette in the Motor City. You had a slew of family there. Two of your great uncles had migrated from Sandersville to Detroit, planted roots, and set out to outdo each other in the baby-making department. In the end, they tied, each fathering a dozen children. One day, your mother tried to break into the boyfriend's safe, and when he came home and discovered the damage, he pulled a gun on both of you. Dressed in nightgowns, you and your mother fled on bare feet through the dark Detroit streets and alleyways. He followed in his Cadillac, one hand steering the car while the other waved the gun. He tried to mow you and your mother down in the asphalt, but you dragged her to safety to her uncle's house. Her uncle had guns too. You survived that, and soon your mother decided she'd had enough of those Midwest winters and that cheating, lying man, and packed you up, heading south to Brooklyn, New York. You arrived in the summer of 1955. Frankie Lyman's Why Do Fools Fall in Love dominated the airwaves. For the first year or so, the two of you bounced between family members until finally your mother rented a 1-bedroom apartment in the Red Hook housing projects, where you shared a room with her that had a view of the East River. You were an adolescent by then, filled with angst and sass and opinions. Your mother didn't use a leather strap to discipline you. Instead, she used words, hurtful, piercing, awful words, words that stabbed and sliced and slashed. Even now, in this her 95th rotation around the sun, her tongue is still a knife. When you were 15 years old, she'd had enough of your insolence and turned you over to the state penal system. So for a year, you were someone else's problem. You survived that and returned to that little apartment overlooking the East River. That apartment was smaller now, not only because you were a year older and a few inches taller, but now there was a man living there with his 4 children. Some more years passed, and your mother married that man, and the whole family moved into a 3-bedroom house in Queens. You were already in love with my father, and in that new house, you made a baby with him. In 1965, with me tucked in your womb, you married my father in that house, just a few feet from where I was conceived.
I just want to breathe for a minute. I just want to breathe. I want to talk about 2 things before we ease into the question and answer period. How did your mother make you the successful woman that you became? And what did you have to forgive her for? My mother made me a successful woman by telling me at the age of 12 that I was going to write a book one day. We were in the kitchen baking biscuits, and she had seen me reading voraciously, writing poems, reading the Washington Post, writing a letter to the editor of the Washington Post that got published. You see me doing all this. And she just looked. Now, my mother I never just saw my mother read a book, but she said, "You're going to write a book one day." And when I was 18, she got me a subscription to the New York Times, which she never read. And I thought that was so symbolic of her desire for me to go into the world that was captured in the New York Times. So that my father made me a writer in some ways, but my mother was just, "You're going to write a book one day. Here's the New York Times." But I had to forgive my mother some things. I had to forgive my mother for telling me that I was going to have to get a light-skinned husband for the sake of my children because of my color. I had to forgive my mother for asking me why I wasn't like my adopted sister, who was effervescent and full of personality, while I was studious and always had my head in a book. So the same mother that told me I was going to write a book one day, with other words, made me feel a little less than, and certainly gave me a colorist wound. And ironically, about that colorist wound is I wrote about that wound and forgiving my mother when I was in my 50s, and I wrote the book, Don't Play in the Sun. And I came to understand how she had been told those kinds of things. And so she naturally told me those kinds of things. But when I think of my mother, I mostly think of what she gave me. I don't think that often of what I have to forgive. Inger?
My mother and father were both educators. My mother was a teacher. My father was a principal. My father was the kind of achievement-oriented, push hard. Why did you get a 99 instead of an 100 on the test kind of person? Nothing is ever good enough. And my mother, having had an experience with a harsh, at times cold mother herself, my grandmother, I think, was trying to change that cycle and was much softer with me. And so while my dad was the hard driver, my mom is the one that encouraged, but in a soft way, in a affirming, validating way. And I mean, even to this day, she'll say things like, don't be so hard on yourself. You know, you worry too much. Let that go. You're overthinking, you know, just kind of affirming and being that other voice to that critical, harsh, never good enough voice that my father planted in the world substantiates. Um, what I had to forgive my mother for is, you know, and I talk about this in the book, I desperately craved what at the time was the ideal, like this ideal Cosby Show family. And I knew that I didn't have that, and I wanted to understand like what was happening in my house. I had a lot of questions. There was a lot of secrecy. You talked about secrecy earlier. That secrecy really fed my anxiety and discomfort, like not really knowing where I fit in, not knowing what I'm supposed to say or not say outside of the house. This duality of like normality, but not normality. And my mother just kind of totally swept it under the rug. And that not knowing, I think it fed some insecurities. And I had to forgive her. And, you know, we come into adulthood and recognize that our parents are humans. And she was like wrestling with her own understanding of our household. And so, you know, I had to forgive her for that. I can remember as a child, like back to what you were saying earlier, telling her to leave, like, let's leave, you know, we'll be fine. Let's leave daddy, you know, we'll be fine. We can do it on our own. And my mom, you know, would just, of course, dismiss it and say, you know, this is how we have the nice life that we have. Like, you're fine. You have a roof over your head. You're well taken care of. You're loved, like, without explaining those intricacies for me. And so, you know, I had in adulthood, I've learned to appreciate, you know, empathize better, empathize with the reasons that she made, the choices that she made. And why she held some things to herself.
Janice?
Wow. Let me see. There's just so much that I'm grateful for as far as my mom is concerned. And I'm probably speaking for not only me, but the rest of my siblings when I say that they made it possible for us to believe that we really could do just about what we wanted to do if we worked hard enough. That there was that sense of expectations in us. They never believed that we couldn't and never gave us the idea that we couldn't. So the sense of expectations, the belief in us, and I always say the permission to dream, and people say, what does that mean? Anybody can dream. They never put any parameters around our dreams. And we were in a position, poverty-wise, what did we have to dream about? I mean, you know, but they said, dream. Dream as big as you want to dream, and then work. And you can achieve things that you would never dream about because it goes beyond even those dreams if you open yourself up. So they gave us that sense that we could, and we were, even though we had nothing. So that was just kind of magical when I look back on it. Neither one of them were educated per se. My mother went to 8th grade. And back in those days, you went to 8th grade, you'd have to leave and go to another place to go to high school. So she wasn't able to do that. My dad, I'm not sure what grade he went to because he left home when he was 11 years old. And he traveled all over the country and came back to marry my mom in reality. So they were just really amazing in what they were able to do together, what they were able to produce together. So I will always be so, so grateful for that. As far as forgiving, I always complained that my brothers really were the favorites. And I don't believe that per se, but we were Southerners, and men just really were. You look to the men first. You fixed food for the men. You washed their clothes and ironed their clothes. And um, my brothers were great athletes, and so a lot of attention were put on them. So I always kind of resented that. So that's, if I had to forgive her for something, I think that would be it. I went through a really short phase of saying, why are we, our family, having to go through what we have to go through? And I would just really be upset with my mother for having children after children after children, because we never get out of poverty that way. But I forgave, of course, I forgave her for that. And all that she gave us, in spite of that, far overreaches growing up with all those siblings, which I adore. So, yeah.
Bernice?
Um, when I was 9 years old, I told my mother that I was going to be a writer. I had been stealing her Harold Robbins and Jackie Collins books. I was over, whatever kiddie books I had. I was like, and so when I discovered her stash, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And and then because I'm writing a memoir, so I've been looking back at these years, and between 1975 and 1976, Sparkle came out, Car Wash, the Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby movie. The title is escaping me. And I went to see these movies. I was 10. I was 10 years old. So it really formed something in my head, and I was already an old soul. So when I told my mother that I was going to be a writer, she was like, okay, you could be anything that you want to be. Absolutely. I'm sure that she probably behind closed doors rolled eyes like, because I was a dreamer, I was daydreamer.
Yeah.
She allowed me to be that child. But she also, because I was very shy, and I could have been, a kid that just stayed inside and, reading and listening to music and never going out socializing. But she pushed me out into the world. I had to go roller skating. I had to go to the park with my brother. Like, she made sure that I didn't become this like individual that just, found solace in my own company. So I appreciate her for that. And just all around support. I mean, I had a daughter at the age of 22, and I was still living at home. We raised her together. So what I had to forgive my mother for was parentifying. I'm the eldest of four, and this is all very recent. It's still kind of raw. I need to say that my father was an alcoholic and probably a narcissist. And so I had to forgive her for not leaving him. The only way that she was free of that relationship was when he died in 2005. They had been married for 40 years.
Wow.
But now looking back, having been involved in my own toxic relationships, like, I understand why she felt it impossible, because of it's like an addiction, the pain that goes along with that. And of course, she was also worried about her children, because she had a job, but he had a better job. So her fear was always having to return to the projects, and she didn't want to have to raise her children in the projects.
Right.
So, like, that's fine. But I have a brother who's 3 years under me, and my mother, this is so clear in my head. I was 5 and he was 3, and my mother left a bottle of milk and a bottle of water and left my brother in the crib. And she went to play bingo. And my father was passed out drunk in the bedroom. And I was responsible for him. I had to take him to school. I had to do all of that. And then at the age of 12, she announced that she was pregnant. And she gave birth to twins in 1978. So in the summer of 79, she stayed home for a year, and then she went back to work. And I took care of those twins at the age of 13 for the entire summer. And so I was the third parent, and I didn't even know there was such a thing as parentification until I was reading a paper by my student. And I was like, that's me. That's me. I always knew there was something wrong, but you raise like you're supposed to help with your siblings, and
Right.
this was taken to a whole different stratosphere. And I was the third parent. And still, I'm still like the third parent. But I had to forgive her because I realized that she didn't know. She didn't know what it was she was doing. That's a form of abuse. And she didn't realize that. So that's the thing I had to forgive her for.
So before we move to take some questions, let's talk about joy. How do you find joy? I mean, for our mothers, we're very lucky to be living in a world where we can talk about all of these things that our mothers and grandmothers couldn't imagine talking about. And we know how important it is for Black women to feel joy, to prioritize celebration. And let's talk about how we bring joy into our lives. Someone asked me yesterday, I was on being interviewed, and they said, what are your major successes? So I said, well, going into therapy, when I realized that the early deaths of my parents was a huge weight on my life, and that I was angry at them and was sabotaging my relationships, successfully going into therapy made me a person who could feel joy. Creating a mentality and a psychology in myself that brought a soulmate. I write about for years being half a woman looking for half a man. And then I became a whole woman and I found a whole man. And that's a source of joy, the relationship that we have. And then I have a very deep relationship with myself, my inner Marita. I meditate every day, and I do periods of silence. And I really cultivate my inner spirit. And that is something that really brings me joy. I value my friends, love spending time with them, but I'm perfectly happy to go on a date by myself to a movie or for a walk. And I find enormous joy in those types of things, and they sustain me emotionally. So how do you find joy, Ingrid?
I think that my relationship with joy really started to change when I separated how I saw myself from my relationship status and from what I was doing at work. I would go through this cycle where every year in January, I would kind of, go down this tunnel of where I was in life, not feeling good enough about it, not married, not having kids, should have done more at work, comparing myself to other people. And it would just be this downward spiral. And I think we've connected on meditation and yoga before. And my yoga practice was really instrumental in transforming that, in transforming how I talk to myself, in creating space, creating boundaries, in developing a practice of gratitude, and just letting go of these expectations about what I should be doing, what I'm not doing. And that practice that was cultivated in yoga, I really try and take off the mat. I'm a big believer in rest. Yoga, of course, is still a part of my joy practice. So just that physical, not just the physical, but that breath work combined with the physical. But taking rest, understanding what healthy relationships look like, both intimate relationships and friendships, and being able to really savor that, being able to appreciate stillness and silence, being able to appreciate the little things. Like the example I always give is my perfect cup of coffee, or in Chicago, that perfect, summer day, which we so desperately crave this time of year, and just noticing it, just not letting those little moments, pass by, which they can so easily do when you're caught up with other things. So that's my joy practice.
Janice?
A lot of the same, but I love outdoors. I love getting close to nature. Nature gives me joy. I don't walk as much as I used to. When I was growing up, I loved walking, being outside and actually talking to the trees and all of that. I'm a loner, and I truly enjoy being alone. Maybe that has something to do with being a writer. I don't know, but I do not need company. There are times when I do not need company. I love my friends, and I absolutely love my family, which is another thing that gives me joy. But I can be by myself and be very happy that way. I love writing. I love reading. I love my grandchildren tremendously. And I love waking up early in the morning and remembering all the things I have to be grateful for. So I do that. I try to do that on a regular basis. So gratitude gives me joy, just thinking of all that I have and all that I have to give. So those are the things that give me joy.
Bernice?
Yeah, similar to Jan, trees are so important to me. They're so important. And, here in New Orleans, we have these beautiful oak trees. And I live downtown now, and we don't have that many downtown. They're close to uptown. And I just love being up there and walking beneath them. But traveling, that's where my joy is. And I love being in the water, near the water. So I spend a lot of money on getting on planes and going to tropical destinations. You look at my feed, and that brings me the most joy. Immersing myself in other cultures, getting to know other people, but the water just it's just like it's cleansing. It's a balm.
Yes.
It's so important to me.
Yes.
So yeah,
definitely. Well, do we have some questions? I'm looking at the chat, seeing if we have any questions.
You don't have any questions, but a bunch of comments. So can you see it on the screen?
Yeah, Sansare Tate says, I was changing diapers by the time I was 6. And my senior year in high school, I had to feed the little kids before I could go out to school. She says this was a great chat.
Yeah. I see there's someone here, Stephanie Smith Long says.
Yeah, my mom is 94 now. And before my dad died last year at 95, she kept the bat by her bed in case he felt froggy. Okay. Okay. What a great question. Rarely get to hear women discuss their moms. Yeah. And I wanted to discuss our mothers not as complaint, but as sources of, inspiration and as well as joy. So I want to end now by asking last question. What one word sums up your mother? For me, I think it's faith. My mother had enormous faith in me. Even though she had a lot of obstacles to overcome, she had enormous faith in herself. Anybody who migrates from the South to the North has faith in themselves. Anybody who plays the numbers the way my mother did has faith in themselves. So I think that her word is faith. What's your mother's word, Inger?
I think it would be contentment. I think my mother is someone who's also grateful for what she has. She's grateful from where she has come, for her relationships, for the life that she was able to build for me. She's a simple woman. She doesn't, crave a lot of material things or, have this sense of lack of fulfillment. And I think that spirit of contentment and gratitude is something that I've learned from her as well.
I think in a society that's always encouraging us to buy more, be more, and be discontent, contentment is a real talent that we need to practice more of. Yeah. Janice?
Love. My mother loved us unconditionally, and none of us, ever thought, oh, she loves that person more, except what I said about the boys. But
exactly.
Other than that, I don't know how she did it. She balanced it. She never made us think she wanted more for the other one than she did for one. So love, and she was able to do a lot with that.
Bernice?
Strength. My mother is one of the strongest women I know.
I think in different ways, all our mothers were probably the strongest women we knew or that we know. So I want to thank you, my sisters, for what was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. It was as deep and as rich as I hoped it would be, and I really loved the readings. I know that everybody in the audience is hoping that what you read, is either part of a book that they can buy or will be part of a book that they can buy. So I want to thank you, Inger, Janice, Bernice, for joining me tonight as we begin to close out Black History Month. Thank you again, and God bless our mothers.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Marita.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.